In 1994, my wife Pam and I led a team of 10 people from Michigan, from a church where I was serving at the time, on a short term mission trip to Kiev in the Ukraine. After an overnight plane trip that was an adventure of its own, and we'll save that story for another time, we landed in Kiev. Were met by our host for the week, along with interpreters, for which I was deeply grateful, and then driven in a variety of cars to the pastor's apartment, where Pam and I would be sleeping that week, and where, along with our entire team, we would have lunch, our first meal in Kiev, which turned out to be a meal of borscht, something I'd never had before, and I soon learned was stew made primarily from beets. Now, in our orientation, we were told anytime we were served food to eat everything we were served, otherwise it would be insulting. And so we did that. Of course, then discovered that when you eat everything you're served, what do? They want to serve you more. Well, I'm not a huge fan of borscht, but I am a huge fan of Kiev and really had a good time there and found other foods we did like. For example, the bread is phenomenal. And in downtown Kiev, if you ever get to go there, right off the main drag on a side street, there is an ice cream place that at that time only served 3 flavors of ice cream: chocolate, vanilla, and ice cream with nuts. Ice cream with nuts is the best ice cream you will ever eat anywhere. It's worth a trip to Kiev just to have that ice cream. Nevertheless, while we were waiting for lunch on that very first day, I was standing looking out a window of the apartment into a courtyard where there was some playground equipment for children and all these tall apartment buildings all around. And I suddenly flashed on an experience I had when I was in grade school. We used to line up in the hallway for lunch before going into the lunchroom, picking up our trays and our food, and then sitting at a table. And on a bulletin board right outside that lunchroom door, there was a map of the world that featured prominently a map of the USSR. Now, I didn't know very much about the USSR at the time. Mainly, what I knew was they were supposed to be our enemies. And every day I remember standing in that lunch line looking at that map. And there were no other markings on the portion that said USSR, which made it all the more spooky. And then it occurred to me while I was looking out that window and remembering that experience that I was at that moment standing on part of that map. And that the people in Kiev who were, when I was young, part of the USSR and no longer were, because this was just a few years after the disillusionment of the USSR, that those people who were supposed to have been my enemies when I was in grade school suddenly were not my enemies. I was told they were my enemies by our government, and now I'm told they're not our enemies by our government. I shared with them in one of my talks that week about that experience of looking at the map and seeing the USSR and recognizing that they were no longer our enemies. But I shared with the good people of Kiev that Jesus wanted us to love one another, whether we were enemies or friends. That was one of those challenging messages that came from Jesus. This week, while preparing the second message in this series, Questions Asked by Jesus, I remembered the experience in the Ukraine. Well, this message today concerns enemies and what to think of enemies and how to treat enemies. Last week, I mentioned the Sermon on the Mount as a passage of teaching that people really admire. Well, there are some things in the Sermon on the Mount that are pretty difficult when you really try to apply them. In this section about enemies, one of the questions, and these are our two questions for today that Jesus asked. If you love those who love you, what reward will you get? And if you greet only your own people, what are you doing more than others? If you only love the people who love you, what's the challenge there? You know, the community we live in is called the Colony. It's a 55 plus community. Upon moving here a year ago, one of the first things we noticed is that everyone waves. If you're walking down the street or driving down the street, people wave at you. And so we quickly caught on to that. And so every time I'm out walking the dog or we're just taking a walk, we wave at the people driving by or other people walking. One of the things I've noticed is sometimes I walk our dog in another part of our town and I involuntarily start to wave at passing cars. According to Jesus, people who have not been redeemed, who do not know the love of God, are able to love those who love them. Parents, siblings, spouses, friends, love one another. Jesus said that if you love those who love you, it's not really a challenge. It's normal, it's common. These questions point to something bigger, something grand. And if you only greet your own people, if you keep within your own small circle, if you spend time only with people who are like you, that's nothing spectacular. What more? Those two words that Jesus used, what more is the key? Jesus wants more from us. Jesus wants us to expand our circle. One of the formulas Jesus used in this portion of the Sermon on the Mount was, you have heard, but I say. And in this he quoted Leviticus 19:8, which says, love your neighbor as yourself. It was very common in that time to then add, but hate your enemies. Leviticus never instructed that. Leviticus said, love your neighbors. It never said, hate your enemies, but it was added to the thought. Isn't it interesting how often people will take an idea from the Bible and then add their own thought as if it's in the Bible? In Leviticus, it doesn't say, love your neighbor and hate your enemy. Jesus wants to stretch us. Most of you have heard me talk about this idea of loving your neighbors. Jesus wanted us to love our neighbors. I hope you will allow these questions to ring into your brain. If you love only those who love you, what reward will you get? And if you greet only your own people, what are you doing more than others? Will you allow Jesus to stretch you? Who are your enemies? Who are the people you do not like? Who are the people with whom you would rather not spend time? You know, we're in an election season. And oh my, don't the tempers really get hot around this time of year? Are your enemies people who have different political convictions? Do you consider them your enemies? I hope not. From some of the things I see people say on the news or I see comments made on Facebook, certainly seems that way. Just a couple of weeks ago, a friend of mine started a discussion on Facebook about a pretty hot topic. And one of his friends, whom I do not know, added a comment, well, anybody who believes differently on this issue is not a Christian, end of story. And I thought, oh my. I'm glad that person is not in charge of who is and who is not a Christian, because he has very narrow parameters. And since I already know that I don't agree with him, that means he believes I'm not a Christian. A friend of mine told me about a small town he lived in his first time as pastor of a church. One of the first things he was told about that small town is that on Main Street, we do not discuss politics or religion. And I thought that was kind of funny, but I understand because those are both pretty hot topics. And people get pretty hot when discussing them. Why can't we have differences of opinion on things? Even in this passage, Jesus points to two groups of people that his hearers would not like: tax collectors and pagans, people they might even hate, consider their enemies. And yet he pointed out that tax collectors and pagans are able to love, to be friendly, to establish warm relationships with others. Isn't it interesting that he chose to compliment two groups whom others would expect him to condemn? He did that often. You have heard that it was said, love your neighbor and hate your enemy. But I tell you, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you, that you may be children of your Father in heaven. He causes his sun to rise on the evil and the good, and sends rain on the righteous and the unrighteous. If you love those who love you, what reward will you get? Are not even tax collectors doing that? And if you greet only your own people, what are you doing more than others? Do not even pagans do that? Be perfect, therefore, as your heavenly Father is perfect. And perfection means that you'll love your enemies. You'll love the people you don't like. And so will you love your enemies? Will you pray for those who persecute you? It's not easy, but if following Jesus was easy, would you want to continue? Who are the beloved? Go and be the beloved.